you know I talk fast, I am now going to be double speed. Interrupt me if I make mistakes. I'm hoping that Chuck will say, here's Barbara, and then we're done with introductions, right? All right.
So I want you all to know, good morning. So you know Assistant Professor Barbara Thiede, you can call her Doctor, you can call her Barbara, you can call her Rabbi, whatever you like. Is that right? Okay.
That is right.
So as you're familiar with some of her work, male friendship, homosociality, and women in the Hebrew Bible. I couldn't remember all that. Rape culture in the House of David, and Yahweh, emotional and sexual life in the Bible in the books of Samuel, and how the deity acts the man. So as you can see, we're full of sexual innuendo, and sometimes it's not innuendo. And we're so glad to have our Rabbi in Residence, Barbara Thiede.
Thank you. Do we need to move the candles so I don't knock them over? It just occurred to me that maybe just out of sheer respect, you might want to make sure that those are not in my way because I can get distracted. Thank you. All right, so for the next 2 weeks, we're going to discuss something called Burlesque in Bible. And as I said, because we're starting late, I'll be a little bit quick in the first part, but I want to begin by reminding you that laughter is actually permitted. Despite the names of all my books, there are reasons to find Bible amusing. And so we're going to do that both today and next week. And we're going to start just by my reminding you, you have to try to remember what kinds of things are in Bible. We have a tendency to have been brought up with an idea around the seriousness of Bible, right? That the Bible is like this serious, didactic set of texts that teaches us morals and how to live. But if you look at the actual contents of Bible, you will find all of these things, and in a wide range of expression, because of course the Hebrew Bible was written over many, 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 many centuries and rewritten over many, many centuries by human beings, and I think this is important to note, understood that it was to be performed. Now this is not only because biblical texts were, as many people feel, once upon a time handed down orally. They were always handed on orally, even after there were written versions of them, and they were also performed. We have psalm texts that call for the voice of God from behind, the scenes, really, and we have texts that suggest that this is how psalms were read in the temple, like performed, almost in this very staged kind of way. We have absolutely clear references from rabbinic texts that the Song of Songs, wait for it, was performed in what were the ancient equivalent of bars. Given the content of Song of Songs, you should not be surprised, because it's a little racy, that stuff, right? And the people who were performing it probably weren't imagining Song of Songs as a love song between God and God's people. That was a later interpretation that helped justify including Song of Songs in the canon. Prior to that time, people were just having a rip-roaring time talking about body parts. Go back and look at it. It's there. Trust me. And, of course, Lamentations, the book of Lamentations, is part of centuries, really of millennia, of laments being a performative genre where people are literally performing this poetry as part of a people lament, a city lament. We have laments from ancient Sumer, from ancient Babylonia. This is one of the genres that is used in times of crisis for people to be able to process their crisis. So all of these, and of course next week I'll point out that the book of Esther is the classic case of genre that is performed, because every year at Purim, Jews perform Esther in multitudinous ways. Trust me, I've written takes on Esther for my then congregation to perform that included Gilbert and Sullivan versions. Yes, I've got a little list. Remember that? Okay. That was Haman. So Esther being another piece that was performed. So I want you to start with the conceptual framework that these texts were performative texts. And then I want to ask you to think about what actually is burlesque? How would we define burlesque and what do we mean by burlesque? So I've given you some features here that includes ridicule and, of course, caricature. And a lot of burlesque has identity confusion. How many of you have seen Mozart's operas where people just can't figure out who people are? People go underground and change identities. Servants become masters. Masters become servants. Role reversals and ludicrous treatment of serious topics, most particularly death. Right? So please remember these features because we're going to see them operating in two spaces of biblical literature today, and again next Sunday when we concentrate on the book of Esther. So I'm just going to remind you, for those of you who've been with me for a long, long time, that I've already talked to you about some burlesque aspects, like the fumbling, mumbling, grumbling deity of Genesis, who, does these wonderful moments. Oh no, where are they? And they're in the center of the garden, right where he planted that tree. Or, oh no, they took from that tree. What if they take from the other tree? Right? There are moments all the way through that Genesis story, including the talking animal, that make it absolutely fit for a performance on stage. Sometimes I've had my students try it out. Like, just be these characters and see what happens, and you might locate all sorts of moments of real humor here. The talking animals, both the serpent and the donkey in the Hebrew Bible, both of whom are truth tellers, both who tell the truth, right? The serpent tells the truth to Eve when he says, God's a little worried about you. You might kind of try to be like him. That's exactly what God is afraid of. Look at the text. If they take from this tree and they take from that tree, you see what I'm saying, right? The donkey of Balaam, who says to her master, why are you beating me? I'm just protecting you, right? And then sexual innuendos and jokes. Many of you have heard me talk about one of my favorite verses in Bible, in Genesis 18, where Sarah says, come on, really, by this time of my life, and she fairly literally says, I've dried up, right? I don't have the fluids necessary to do this thing. And with him as old as he is, right? I mean, it's the Viagra moment in Bible, and it's cute, and it's funny if you are understanding that Bible was written by people and performed by people who meant it to be entertainment, not necessarily a moral text telling you how you should live your life. So we're going to take two test cases, and the first one is Genesis 27, which is one of the most hilarious chapters in the Hebrew Bible. It really is. I tried to get AI to give me a picture of Isaac lying, on his deathbed, and then Jacob dressed up with goat skin, and it kept giving me a man with horns on his head, and it didn't work so well. But, what is the setup here? So Isaac is maybe on his deathbed. He refers to death twice in the first 4 verses. I might be dying. I might be dying. For me, this is pardon the sort of ethnic moment, this is the Jewish mother thing. Oi! Right? I could be on my deathbed. I haven't tried this with my son, but I'll let you know how it goes when I do. Rebecca is eavesdropping, so think about this in terms of the stage. He's lying on his bed, talking about death. She's at the door of the tent, listening in. Again, think of those Mozart operas or even Shakespearean comedy. We've got whispers and plans, and Jacob is afraid that if his father touches him, he'll immediately know that he's Jacob, not Esau, because Esau is the hairy guy, right? So we've got this kind of ribald conversation about the body here going on, and then Jacob gets dressed up as a goat, and all those exclamations are deliberate. Because if you think about the text in this way, it becomes infinitely funny. right, if you put it on a scene. And don't ever forget that this man who is on his deathbed lives decades after this episode. For decades, right? So, it's a little bit suspect, this idea. So, what do we see happening? We get a lot of parental confusion here, a lot of identity change or switch or identity confusion. Who is Jacob? Who is Esau? And I've given you two translations here of the Hebrew texts, right? And the verse here is often translated, which one of my sons are you? But the actual Hebrew, which reads, Mi ata beni, is literally, who, me, ata, are you? Then, beni, my son. Now, I often ask my students, how often have your parents suspected that you've been up to something? And they look at you and say, who are you, my son? Right? There's a different question being asked than which of my sons are you? Like, who are you that you're trying to put one over me? Your voice doesn't really sound like the voice of Esau. So you already have this confusion or this suspicion on Isaac's part. And if you read this even in English translation, you should look and count. I ask my students, count the amount of times Isaac says, really? Which might make you wonder, does he have an idea what's going on and is playing along? There have been some people who thought that's exactly what's going on. Jacob comes here, the hands are the hands of Esau. How many of you have gone to the petting zoo? How many of you have stroked the goats with your little kids or grandkids, right? How many of you said, oh, that must be just what a hairy man feels like? Really? Really? Come on. They knew, especially in agricultural world where people were living with animals all the time, they knew quite well that this was ridiculous. They knew that this was absurd. And we read it as if that is like a serious moment. It is not. No, it is most clearly not at all a serious moment. It's meant to be funny to imagine Jacob with goat skin around his neck, with goat skin on his hands. Just for a moment, try to be your own AI and put a picture in your head of a man with goat skin all over him. You don't even need the horns. It should make you laugh, right? And then, of course, the illusions around goats and what goats are like are not unknown to the ancient world either. So just as Chuck said, there are always these moments that are somewhat sexual in their humor as well, right? Jacob dressed in a goat skin has a lot of potential readings for those who are in this ancient world and watching this being performed or seeing it being performed. So what else have we got? One of the things I want to point out to you is that when the Hebrew is often translated, let me go back just a little bit, and his father is wondering about him, and it says in one of these translations, he didn't recognize him. Please start on the assumption that traditore I traduttore, which means the trader is a translator. Traders have to be traders. And why? Because you have to make a choice about how you're translating every verb, every word, every noun, every adjective. Those of you who know anything about translating from one language to another know how difficult this is. I dare anyone in the room who took German to give me a one-word translation for the word gemütlich. Try it. You will fail. Right? It's just not possible. Gemütlich means being at a barbecue and having guests around and things being comfortable and fun. You can't do it in one word. It's just not possible. You can't. I know. I lived in Germany for many years, and when people said, let's have a Kaffeeklatsch, it's so gemütlich, right? That was the whole environment of sitting around with the coffee and the cake and the relatives and the chit-chat, right? Like it was the whole environment. So we have that same problem here with this word that means he did not recognize him, because that word, which comes from the root nun, kaf, and resh at the top there, can mean any one of these things: regard, recognize, take notice, or pay attention. Ruth uses this to say, "Oh, how are you paying attention to me, O Boaz, because I am such a humble creature?" You'll find this in Psalms being used to refer to being regarded, whether you have regard from a person. So already that little thing about what Isaac is doing, does he not have regard for the son who's trying to cheat him, right? Does he not pay attention? Is he not taking notice? Or is he simply not recognizing? You see the multiple ways that you might read that? The fact that you can read it multiple ways is funny, right? It lends itself to bringing in the humor of the text, because there are different ways to be thinking about it. So, again, this question, are you really my son, Esau? That is, again, meant to be part of the burlesque, the identity switching, the confusion about who is who. This man on his deathbed with eyes so heavy that he cannot see. And yet, this constant, reminder to the audience that Isaac may or may not know who is before him, is asking or is questioning, this is all meant to emphasize the humor of the moment, right? Not once, not twice. Isaac really repeatedly wonders what the heck is going on. Again, does this sound familiar with the kind of comedy and burlesque you might associate? I associate it very much with Mozart's silly operas where people are constantly dressing up as different characters, right? But you know what I'm trying to say here. Identity confusion is essential. And keeping in mind, remember I said that you take serious topics like death and you kind of play with them? Right? This whole thing starts with Isaac saying, "I'm on my deathbed. Bring me my last meal, and I will bless you." Right? It's, again, this kind of taking death and making it a little bit humorous, because everybody knows that Isaac lives for decades after this. Everybody knows that. Jacob goes off. He sires 12 children in the interim. That's a lot of years, people, right? So people know that this is meant to be funny because they're being given repeated clues. And one other thing that I should mention is that very often some parts of Hebrew Bible kind of do a funny take on other parts of Hebrew Bible that are serious. So in Genesis 22, when Abraham is walking Isaac to his potential sacrifice, one of the key words in that text, which appears 3 times, is hineni. I am here. I am present. I am ready to be called for whatever duty I have. Rather ridiculously, the term hineni shows up in this text as well, where Jacob says and Esau say, hineni, I am here. In this kind of humorous text, we're recalling the patriarch where death really was a serious and scary thing. And in this text, we're kind of recalling it in a humorous way. Do you see how I'm speaking about effectively signaling already? This particular death sequence is not serious. This one, it's not fun. And the presence and being called up for a duty is a wholly different story in this version than we have in Genesis 22. So, what do we have? Genesis 27 as burlesque. Do we have all those elements? Do we have ridicule? Do we have caricature? Do we have identity confusion? Do we have role reversals? Do we have ludicrous treatment? We do. You can find every single one of these in Genesis 27. And folks, I honestly want you to try to put yourself, this is the time when I do my historian thing. How many of you know what this refers to? There we go. And you see it coconut tree, coconut falling on the ground. So Kamala Harris's mother would sometimes say to her daughters, "What, you think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You are a part of the context in which you live." So we always have to think about what is the context of the material that we study in the ancient world too. And in the ancient world where there is no TV, there is no Spotify, there are no TikTok settings, where is your source of entertainment, my friends? You are. And you are. And you are. Right? We entertain each other with music, with performance, with storytelling, with poetry. So all of this is performative material that is, again, meant to entertain. Later we got the idea that it was meant to teach us morals. But that doesn't actually show up until a couple centuries before the Common Era, before the birth of Jesus. So, all right, so let's take a look at Saul. Oh my gosh, have I spent a lot of time with the story of Saul. And I want to emphasize here that because Hebrew Bible is multivalent, and you can read it in multiple ways, it makes it like a rubber because it's pretty flexible. I have read the story of Saul as a trauma story. Is that me, by the way? Okay. As a trauma story, that Saul is effectively traumatized by what he experiences. All right, we can. It's from on high. You know what? I can use the hand. I think that might be a little bit less distracting. Oh my goodness, that was very distracting. And now you're all awake.
Testing.
Okay, we will just do that. And a moment for, what do we call this?
Technical difficulties.
Technical difficulties, or I think there's a clothing malfunction is also one of the words we use for that. Okay, so Saul, right, can be a trauma story, a story of incredible pain. And I've written an article about this, and Saul as a character who is abused and harmed comes up quite a lot in my third book. And yet, I can also show you that Saul's story can be read with humor and hilarity. So he is introduced right at the get-go as the son of a really important dude who either has money or has valor, depending on how you translate the Hebrew text. And Saul is lined up in our imagination in the opening of chapter 9, along with all other male Israelites. Now just imagine hundreds of thousands of male Israelites all standing in front of you, right? That's already pretty funny, right? Like, in what kind of setting do we have that? I mean, none of the seats in the arena are free. That's how many men are there. And what happens? He's so tall and he's so noticeable that you can still set him apart from every other male Israelite, right? He's more handsome than anyone else. He stands head and shoulders. He's practically a giant. Remember that even though he's practically a giant, he is not the one who goes out and fights Goliath. So we've got this big dude, this really big dude, and he is noticeable by everybody. So he looks pretty imposing. He's big, but maybe not so bright. The hunt is on, and we have a ridiculous task. It's the task of fables and fairy tales. Oh, we have to find donkeys. There are 3 donkeys that have run away, right? Doesn't this sound like kind of a Grimm's fairy tale kind of thing, you know? The hero has to go off and find some animals in order to achieve his destiny. And so off he goes, and this is my translation of a section of that chapter. Let's go home. That's Saul, right? We can't find the donkeys. We don't know where they are. Dad's going to start worrying about us. We should just go home. And the servant says, well, how about this? Let's go ask the prophet about donkeys. You're going to go ask the man of God, where are my donkeys? Can we just think about how ridiculous that is? Right? Think about that. You don't ask a prophet about where your livestock is. Right? That's not what prophets are supposed to do. And Samuel at this point is not only a prophet, but he is effectively the high priest of Israel. He's the leader of Israel. He does everything. He's a big dude. He's kind of important. And Saul's immediate reaction, and somehow nobody notices, how is it that the servant knows that the prophet's there and Saul doesn't? But okay, he's right around the corner. He's down this town. Let's go. Saul, I don't have any money. How are we going to pay him? Does it ever occur to you how bizarre it is that the servant has the money? Isn't that a little weird and funny? Again, are we seeing role reversals? Who's the master? Who's the servant? Who's in control? Who has charge? I'm not even talking to you about they get to the town and Saul is going, I have no idea where to go. And some, girls come down the street and he asks the girls. I mean, it's burlesque. It's humorous. He's asking everybody where to find the dude, and what happens when they actually see each other. The prophet doesn't recognize Saul, has to be told by God. That's the one. That's the one I'm choosing. And Saul walks right up to Samuel and says, can you tell me where to find the seer? To the seer. Right? It's like deliberate blindness and being unable to see things is actually a motif in the books of Samuel. Who can see and who cannot? Who is blinded, who is not? Remember, Eli also loses his sight. There's like multiple places where who has vision becomes a really important part of the narrative. So here we've got this. It's, you can't even recognize the most important dude in all Israel. You gotta think that they're not necessarily solely alone, and other people might have done things to indicate, that's the prophet, right? It becomes, frankly, absurd that Samuel, the prophet, has to be told by God which dude to look at, even though he stands, remember, head and shoulders among all others. We were told at the beginning he stands apart, but Samuel doesn't see it, and Saul doesn't see Samuel. So what happens at the coronation? Israel gathers at Mizpah, and the prophet Samuel speaks, and he gives them a lecture. You wanted a king, you bad Israelites. All right, I'm going to give you a king, if you have to have a king, right? Like it's kind of a sardonic, angry thing. But then Samuel does a whole intense ritual. It's really dramatic. It's a scene. He uses lots. And first, all the lots indicate which tribe. And then all the lots are drawn again and indicate which family. And then all the lots are drawn and indicate Saul. Right? All of Israel is watching this spectacle. Think about conventions right now. There is a spectacle going on here, and all of Israel is witnessing it. And what happens? Does anybody remember what happens? No one remembers. Saul is hiding among the baggage. He has absolutely no interest in becoming king, and he's hiding from the people who want to acclaim him. The tallest, gigantic dude in Israel is curling himself up to hide among the stuff that people brought to Mizpah to feed themselves and to clothe themselves and to house themselves with. Yes, Debbie, it is hilarious. When you read it in the Hebrew, you go, what? He's hiding in the baggage? And it's Samuel's big moment, and what's happening, and what do the people of Israel have to do? They don't go back to Samuel. Samuel is completely shamed in front of everybody. They go to God and say, God, by the way, where is he? And God says, he's hiding on the baggage. You don't believe me? Go look. Go look. God says, he's over there. That's where you'll find him. And then Samuel brings them out, and it's impossible really to tell the extent to which this next line is another moment of complete hilarity. Think about it. Do you see the one whom the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him. He was just hiding among the baggage. There's no one like him. And all the people, this is all the men, people is a word that refers to the men of Israel, are kind of acting in this humorous way too. Oh, long live the king that we've just had to drag from behind the suitcases. It is funny. It is true. If I put this on stage with you as actors, the rest of you would just be rolling on the ground. It's really a funny moment. So again, if we look through all of these characteristics, are we finding them? In this case, what we have is a ludicrous treatment of a serious topic, which is the monarchy and the insult that affords to the real king of Israel, who is supposed to be God, right? Nobody can really be king of Israel except God. So all of this is a little bit of a joke around that whole piece. But identity confusion and role reversals and all that jazz, right? The servant becoming the master, things like that. The ridicule, the caricature is pretty obvious. So what I want to do, because I was warned ahead of time around time, I think I managed it, Debbie. I cut a couple of slides because I thought it would be so much more fun to find out what you had to say and what your questions would be about burlesque in Bible. So Debbie's going to be so kind as to pass this around to anybody who has comments or questions, and then she'll bring it back to me and I'll answer. Are we ready to go? Yes, you'll get your steps in. I have my step counter right there.
I just have to start by saying I'm disappointed that you didn't come in wearing a rubber nose and mustache and everything. So, really thought you would.
I'm not kidding. I wear it for my students at UNCC. I do have a grouch.
Okay. Questions? Who has a question or comment? Oh, come on, you guys. Okay, I'll start it out by saying this last story. I mean, how many times have we read these stories and not seen what you brought to us? So thank you for that. But I'm thinking, if God told Samuel, that's the one, why didn't God tell Saul, you're the one? So
Saul,
Yes.
he was a
An answer to her?
no.
Okay, hold on.
Okay.
Let me answer her,
Yes.
and then we'll get your
Sorry.
question. So I'm going to answer her first. Why does God not say to Saul, oh, by the way, that's the prophet? My read on this is actually a take that is consistent with what I say in my book, which is that the deity promotes Saul only as a model of what goes wrong with a king, and he deliberately embarrasses and humiliates Saul repeatedly and over and over and over again, and the deity's actions towards Saul really are quite disturbing if you take a close look at them. So I think that's why he never gives Saul a clue of anything that's going to happen to him at all. Okay.
Sorry.
that's okay.
So with Saul, do you think? Okay, sorry. So with Saul, do you think some of this is a joke because it shows that if you're given everything, that it kind of makes it where you don't have to work for anything, and it's like a slap in the face because he was wealthy, handsome, big, and it shows that he was almost a coward by hiding? Do you think it's some sort of underlying meaning that because of he was given all these things, that it shows that that's not always the best way to handle something? Like sometimes you have to work for stuff versus given everything.
So one of our capacities as readers of Bible is to consistently read in various kinds of moral lessons, because that's what we've been taught to do. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Could you, I said, Bible is multivalent. Can you sit here and say, oh, he's got everything, and then he has to learn how hard he has to work for everything? I would say my difficulty with that reading is that Saul, in fact, doesn't want the crown. he doesn't want to be given everything. He is hiding from this responsibility. I think he'd rather be out, in the field. When we see him in chapter 11, when the King Nahash comes to attack Yabesh Gilead, he's out with his oxen in the field. And people have to come and say, dude, this guy is on our borders and threatening us, and God invokes the spirit in him. He turns into a berserker, leads people to war. To take on the responsibility for an entire people and a war against enemies left, right, and center of you is a pretty scary thing, right? So personally, I think Saul does about as well as he can do with this in the early chapters, and repeatedly, nevertheless, gets punished for it. So another example would be Saul waiting for Samuel, Samuel telling him, you've got 7 days, I'll arrive in 7 days, we'll do the sacrifice. You have to do a sacrifice before going to war, make sure God approves, right? And then we go to war, and Samuel doesn't show up, and doesn't show up, and doesn't show up. And Saul is left completely hanging. His men are absconding because they haven't got God's blessing. They think they're all going to die. He's left with like 600 men, and he performs the sacrifice out of desperation to keep his men there and invoke God's blessing. Then Samuel shows up and excoriates him and tells him, you did exactly the wrong thing. How dare you? How you flouted the command of God, even though God was never involved in the command that he wait 7 days. I mean, it's confusing as all hell. Poor guy, So I have some real sympathy with Saul. But I'm not saying you can't read it that way, because you can read it anyway. Okay, you know what? Maybe I can just do this.
So my question is going back to Genesis. So I have heard that, I know in Genesis 1, there's sort of the account where God makes everything and he says, and it's good. And then in Genesis 3, you get another account where God makes Adam and it's not good for him to be alone. And that's when you get the whole narrative with the snake in the garden, the more burlesque scene that you were talking about. And I've read that there's some scholarship that thinks that those were two different accounts written at different times. The second one being the older narrative. And I was just curious what your thoughts are on that.
There is absolutely no doubt that there are two Genesis accounts. We could do, we've never done this. We've never done the documentary hypothesis in here, where I detail who wrote what and how do we know it. Is this a thing? Do we need to do that sometime? We should. So the first Genesis story is written by the author we call the P writer, and you can identify the P writer in all sorts of ways, including how there's certain terminology that only the P writer uses, like tabernacle only shows up in the P writer. Well, priestly writer, he's interested in priestly ritual. Sabbath shows up in the P writer, right? Circumcision shows up in the P writer. J writer writes the next story, and that is an older account. In the J and the E writers, you have angels, you have a kind of mumbling, bumbling, fumbling God, as opposed to the God on high saying, I say this shall happen, and it is good. I'm simplifying here a little bit for time, but yes, those are two completely different stories. And there are what we call doublets and even triplets of versions of stories in the Hebrew Bible. And the cool thing is that those who redacted it thought it was all right to have competing stories told multiple times. This might be a topic sometime where we just take a look at doublets, stories told twice and three times. Who killed Goliath? How many of you are going to say David? It wasn't Elhanan? Because in another part of the text, it says Elhanan killed him. And then in a third part of the text, it says, Elhanan killed Goliath's brother, and David killed Goliath in order to reconcile the problem. Trust me when I say, yes, there are multiple writers at work with competing views on all sorts of things, which is itself funny. Yes. Okay, I've got one back there after you, so I see you.
I'm always curious with authors, what was your initial spark to inspire you to write about the burlesque component?
About what component?
The burlesque in Scripture.
So I haven't, burlesque hasn't been a major theme, but it does show up in my current book where I write a little bit about the burlesque that is almost painful around Saul. Mostly what I have written about for 3 books, to be perfectly honest, is biblical hegemonic masculinity. Those are big words, but what is, people would have called this patriarchy, about 20, 30 years ago. And it's about how the writers are setting up a system that valorizes a certain kind of masculinity. So that's been my major theme over 3 books, and how that ends up also contributing to a literary corpus that permits a great deal of sexualized violence to be part of its pages. And I want to say right ahead of the game that this is not just a Hebrew Bible / Old Testament thing. There are many of scholars who are working on the sexual violence of the New Testament, particularly scholars who, like me, have been working on male-on-male sexualized violence, which has become recently a piece. Why is that important to me? I've spent 40 years looking at 3 things in all of my life. And let me just say quickly, I started by looking at the enslaved peoples of Potosi who worked in the silver mines for the Spanish conquistadores. So what things have always motivated me? Issues of oppression, issues of abuse, issues of violence. That's the through line through all of my work, whether it's been about the American Jewish response to the Holocaust, which is part of my first career as a historian, or the writing I do now about sexual violence in Bible. I just gravitate towards looking at what is harmful, because I think that naming it is a way that we understand what we need to do to make a world that divests itself of those things. I hope that made sense. Where did burlesque come from? Burlesque also has a dark edge, which we'll see a little bit more in Esther. And so burlesque is funny, but it also steps into a space of pain in many interesting ways. And I'll give you a trigger warning around the Esther piece. An example of this is when Esther asks for permission to slaughter the enemy, and the text of Esther gives an absolutely astronomical number of people that are killed by the Jews, who were the victims almost of a genocidal attempt on their people's lives by Haman. Dark edges, right? Okay, let me get back to this gentleman back here.
I think you partly answered my question before. You know, I was thinking ahead about David and Goliath. And my understanding was that Saul had given David permission to do it. And then all of a sudden Saul sees this happening, and he says, who is that man who killed Goliath? And somebody, I think at that point, said David, but it may be somebody else. But I'm thinking he gave him permission, but then he's asking who was the one that killed him.
This woman right here, this woman here, explained the answer to that problem. Those are 2 different narratives of how David came to Saul's court. In one narrative, he comes to Saul's court in order to propitiate a king who, by the way, God has inflicted with an evil spirit, so that Saul starts suffering from bouts of madness. One of his courtiers says, there's this dude who can sing well, you know, bring him in, he'll help you out. And that is the first version of David's arrival. And the second version is that he comes to the battlefield and sees Goliath. And the 2 issues of Saul saying, I give you permission, and then later asking who killed him, are due to 2 different writers' accounts being woven together, which sometimes can be very confusing for all of us. Yes. Like, think about the whole flood story. Are you supposed to take 2 of every animal, or 7 pairs of clean and 1 pair of unclean? I can talk to you about why those are completely competing views. The J writer and the P writer have different ideas, and they have to do with sacrifice. So you get completely contradictory ideas of how many animals and in what number are going to be on the ark, or the number of days that the flood happens, 40 days or over a year. Depends on which version you're looking at. Yeah. Okay. Other comments or questions? Okay, so oh wait, there is another question. And if anybody wants to do their homework, you can go read Esther, keeping in mind that your version of Esther is not my version of Esther.
That's what I was going to ask. Would it help for us?
to read the book of Esther. Well, it would mostly help if you would read the one in the Hebrew Bible, because the one that that's not hard. Go to sepharia.org. You'll find the book of Esther right there. I can send a note to Debbie, and maybe they can put a note in some kind of communication with you, because your version of Esther is the cleaned up, pious Esther. She's a good girl, she's a good Jewish girl, it has God in it. The older version of this is drugs and rock and roll, and God is never mentioned. Yeah, no, I'm telling you, it's a raw, fun text that way. Yeah, so. Wonderful. I'll send a link where you can go, and you can read the Hebrew too. I'll send it to you on a website where it'll give English, Hebrew, and you can study the Hebrew too.